Good morning from the National Newsroom. We're here today to talk about the results of the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election. I'm Abbi Garton-Crosbie, one of the political reporters at the paper, and I'm joined by Steph, Brawn, my fellow political reporter, who was at the count in Hamilton last night. So we will get to the juicy gossip of what happened on the ground. But first of all, headline: Labour won the by-election, which was called after SNP Minister Christina McKelvie sadly died earlier this year. There was a lot to the campaign and what happened, but we'll get straight to the results. So Labour won with, Labour won with 32% of the vote, with the SNP coming in second at 29%, and then Reform came in third place. So what was your reaction to that, Steph? Obviously you were there last night, so what was the kind of feeling at the count, and what was the response when that result actually came in?
Yeah, I think the result was a big shock. The bookies had the SNP as odds-on favourites to win the by-election. It's a seat that they have always held since it was created in 2011. Christina McKelvie won it 3 times in a row: 2011, 2016 and 2021. So I think there was a feeling that the campaign had gone well enough for them, and it was going to be maybe tight, but all right on the night. But as the night unfolded and I was chatting to people and things like that, it became clear that Reform were going to do very well. I mean, 26% is extraordinary, and it does show that they are going to have a serious impact on the Scottish elections next year. No mistake about that. But it became pretty clear quite quickly that they weren't going to finish second. They were going to come up just short of that. But as I say, 26% is a decent result for them. As the night drew on, what became clear was it was going to be very tight between SNP and Labour. But until the result was actually read out, no one really had any idea. And I think it came as quite a big shock that, I suppose, in a by-election, Labour won it reasonably comfortably. We could have had a much tighter result. It could have been a couple hundred votes in it. There had ended up being more than 600. So yeah, big shock. There was quite a defiant message from Anna Sarwar, talking about he felt that Davy Russell had come under quite an attack from the media, felt that he had suffered some classist, elitist comments fired at him. And in contrast, the SNP presence in the room, which was quite significant during the night, totally vanished within minutes. I did not see Katie Loudon leave. She just completely vanished. The only SNP person I managed to catch sight of after the result was Jamie Hepburn, who was about to leave. He was the campaign manager, I believe. And I think it was a really tough night for them. You could see on some of their faces, some of the chats that were going on in little corners of the room, that it didn't look like it was necessarily going to be a good one for them.
I mean, it's obviously there's been a lot of chat about the SNP's campaign and how they ran this morning. Our colleague Laura Pollock is currently speaking to activists and people who were on the ground as part of the SNP's campaign to kind of dig into this a bit further, which we'll have up on the website later this afternoon. But I think one of the key things that's came across is we saw this shift during the by-election campaign, which I'm sure you noticed as well, that from it being an SNP versus Labour fight, the SNP then started to focus their attention on Reform and Nigel Farage. And that element, I think, particularly because the bookies and a lot of chat was that they were going to come in second, which obviously didn't happen. But it was interesting to see that shift in the narrative, particularly from John Swinney saying, we were the only ones that can stop Reform. Whereas Labour took a bit of a different tact, I think, with their campaign, because Davy Russell was a local candidate. Obviously, he lives in the area and was knocking a lot of doors. I think a lot of analysis has been saying he was kind of more on the ground, despite this refusal to be in any of the TV debates or do media appearances. He still managed to win the seat, which is quite a strange thing to happen, because you would expect with less of a media presence that he would not have done well, but he has still won the seat. I mean, what's your response to how that shift in the campaigning happened?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It does seem like Labour have run quite a clever campaign on the quiet, and they've clearly gone back to basics and knocked on a lot of doors and collected a lot of data, found out where their voters are, and that's been an interesting and clever approach from them. I think it does show in the end that negative politics doesn't work. The SNP, I think, were at some points they were talking about delivering this message of hope, but then I think as the media started asking more and more questions about reform, they kind of caved in and just and John Swinney actually ended up saying that it was a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform last week. He said that, embarrassingly now, he said that Labour are out of it, I think were his words. And I think it's just a sign that I think parties have got to focus on their own message. I mean, I think that is what Labour have done, like I say, on the quiet a bit, because Davey hasn't really appeared in any debates. But that is what they have done, and the SNP have suffered on the back of changing tack and saying, we're the only ones that can stop reform. So I think there's been some interesting comments made on the radio today of SNP figures saying that we never said that Labour were out of this contest, when they absolutely did say that. So they're really scrambling at the moment. And I think we heard Mary McCallan saying that the Labour campaign was I can't remember her words. What did she say? Dreadful. I think she said it was dreadful. And I'm not entirely sure how that goes down, because at the end of the day, Labour still won this contest. And I don't know how well people will react to the SNP being overheard complaining about this result. It is what it is, and they need to reflect on it and do some serious soul searching.
Yeah, I think the messaging clearly from the SNP needs to be refined. We've had kind of two aspects of this, which probably I said Laura Pollock is going to dig into with her piece, which is, do the SNP push the independence button, which essentially go hard on the independence angle? But we've also heard from Keir Starmer this week that he would not allow a referendum during his tenure as Prime Minister. Or do they focus on, delivering in the next however many months we've got until Holyrood 2026, because that is the next big test for the SNP and for Labour. And I think one of the kind of big things that's going to come out of this, particularly for Labour, is they are going to argue that Anna Sarwar is next First Minister in waiting. And we've already kind of seen that with what he said after the election this morning, because they had a rally in Hamilton this morning. However, John Curtis, our favourite pollster, has said, warned against that, to not get too complacent for Labour, I think, because while Labour did win it, it was still tight between the SNP and Labour. As you said, there's only about 600 votes in it. And then when you kind of extrapolate that out to the rest of Scotland, there's kind of different constituencies and different issues that are going to come up. So it is still going to be tight in Holyrood 2026, but we're definitely going to see this narrative from Labour that, renewed boost to Anna Sarwar for his bid to be First Minister. For sure, he's not going anywhere. I think if they'd lost, maybe his leadership would have been a bit shaky, but now he's probably bedded in. He's going to see this through. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. And obviously the big outlier for this campaign was Reform. We've never really seen Reform kind of place this high in a by-election before, because obviously in England they did really well in the local council elections, but this was kind of big first Scottish test for them. So what I thought was interesting about that was the kind of media buzz around Farage. Now, I wonder if that's because it's a bit new, and obviously the last by-election that we had was SNP Labour straight fight, so it gave the media something a bit more different to focus on and a bit more interesting, because we saw last week our colleagues were in Hamilton when Farage had come down to do a campaign visit, and he essentially left the media waiting in a car park for 2 hours and didn't show up to what was supposed to be a walkabout around Hamilton. But earlier that morning, we'd seen him attack the Herald for allegedly, well, they didn't, but claiming that they had basically conspired with protesters outside of where he was in Aberdeen. So we've seen this sort of anti-establishment media, legacy media attack kind of coming from Farage, which was straight out of the Trump playbook. And obviously the Herald have completely denied that and said that they didn't. So I wonder if how you feel about that, about the Reform aspect. I think we're definitely going to see some Reform MSPs maybe off the list next year. What's your view?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I spoke to John Curtis before this by-election, and he was saying that there was all sorts of buzz around Reform. Some people even saying that they might win this by-election. Mm-hmm. But John Curtis, he poured cold water straight on that. He said, they're probably going to come a good third. They might come second, but he couldn't really see it. So it's he's a clever man. It's panned out almost exactly as he said. He did say the SNP were favourites, but he was by no means sort of saying that was nailed on or anything like that. Yeah, I think I think with Reform, yeah, like I say, 26% is a huge boost for them, and they are definitely going to get MSPs. And I think what's interesting is that the chat is that they've obviously taken a huge amount of votes from the Conservatives. That they've left the Conservatives in an absolutely awful place. I mean, the Conservatives have done that to themselves as well. But the other chat was that they were taking votes from Labour in this by-election, but clearly that hasn't happened enough. And you wonder where where the SNP sit in all of this. It's really sort of. It's really sort of suggested that Reform are going to play a big part, and they're going to be in some 3-horse races next year, no doubt. But it can be difficult to take things from by-elections sometimes, that they can lie outside of what's going on nationally. But yeah, they're going to have a big part to play for sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially because obviously Labour, we've had the winter fuel payment and lots of stuff from down in Westminster and the policy decisions that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been making, which you would have thought might have made a bit more of an impact on the Labour vote, but clearly that hasn't happened. So that'll be interesting to see how that kind of works as we go up to Holyrood 2026, and how much of an impact what Westminster Labour do has on Scottish Labour compared to that. So it'll be interesting to see. But as you said, the Conservatives, they were just under 6% of the vote, so they didn't lose their deposit, which you lose if you don't get 5% of the vote, but they were close. So, it was a pretty bad result for the Tories last night, to be honest. I think every other party underneath them did lose their deposit. But it will definitely be interesting to see how this all impacts the campaign when we run up to Holyrood 2026 in May next year. But Steph has a wonderful piece from on the ground at the by-election last night on our website that you can read, which kind of goes into all the details about what happened. We're still running a live blog with all the reaction and response, and we'll have some more analysis up on the website later on. I'm going to look at Labour's campaign and how that managed to win the by-election. So thank you very much for joining us. As we said, everything is on the national.scot, and we will see you later. Thank you. Goodbye.